Welcome to Design Domination, where you'll gain confidence, clarity, and a competitive edge in a crowded marketplace so you can dominate your competition. Hi, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Colleen Grotzer, and in this episode of Design Domination, I'm joined by special guest Andrew Summers. We're going to talk about some information that really changes the game when it comes to contrast and accessibility. So stick around to find out how this is going to change things quite a bit when it comes to WCAG 3. Andrew Summers has more than 35 years of professional media experience in the Hollywood film and television industry. As a recognized industry guru and technology evangelist, he's worked design, color, imaging, typography, lighting, cinematography, visual effects, and immersed himself in practical applications of technology in the field, including through the transition from chemical images like film to digital imaging. And several years ago, Andrew's eyesight became severely impaired due to early onset cataracts and related complications. But not to allow decades of color knowledge to go to waste, he refocused his research toward visual accessibility, becoming an invited expert with the World Wide Web Consortium, where he contributes as a co-author of the future WCAG 3 guidelines. Not only that, but his research led to the APCA contrast method, which we'll get into, and this is rapidly being adopted in design systems and with modern color tools. This year, he founded Inclusive Reading Technology, Inc., which is a nonprofit consortium focused on improving readability for all. Well, that was a mouthful of credentials. Welcome to the podcast, Andy.
Thank you very much, Colleen. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Just fine, thank you.
All right, so I wanted to start off with a few fun questions like usual. And so because of your background, I absolutely have to ask you what your favorite place to film has been.
The snarky answer is everywhere the story is best told. I live here in Southern California, and I live in the Los Angeles area, and it is such a great place to shoot simply because there's a wealth of every kind of look that you might want. In downtown, there's the new buildings, but there's also the very old buildings. And we can cheat Chicago down there. We can, cheat in New York down there. And then half an hour to just an hour away, we've got the mountains, or we've got the ocean and the beach. We've got skiing, or we've got desert. Pretty much everything.
Right.
Really within just a short drive. I'd say one of my favorite places, though, recently is I've been shooting drone footage, and I took my drone out to Tehachapi Wind Farm, and there's just there must be 1,000 of these giant windmills. Each one is like 40 stories tall. They're insanely huge. There's like 1,000 of them. There's like this field of gigantic windmills out in the middle of the Mojave Desert. And it's just like 45 minutes from here. So that was a really fun shoot, just flying around all of those things. So I'd say that's probably my favorite place in the last year or so.
Oh, that's cool. Reminds me of Don Quixote.
Yeah.
With the windmills.
Yes. Tilting at windmills with a little drone. Exactly. That's funny. I didn't think about that.
Okay. And the other question I had is, what's the worst job that you've ever had?
There's one that immediately comes to mind, and it was right after the best film I ever worked on. The best film I ever worked on was Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line. And the film that we worked on right after that was Battlefield Earth. That film swept the Razzies, meaning it got worst film, worst director, worst writer, worst everything. Except for sound. I happened to be working on the sound design. The spaceship sounded cool. The funniest thing about that movie was when the New York Times reviewer did the review of Battlefield Earth, he ripped it apart, panned everything. This guy was terrible. That guy was terrible. I'm not going to mention names. You know who was in it. He got to the very end of the review, and the last thing in his review was the only thing professional about this film was the sound, which was excellent. So me and the rest of the sound crew were kind of like, hey, because if you're working on sound, this was back in the 90s. You don't get a lot of attention. It's like, even though it's more than half of the perception of the film. So there's
true. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. So, okay. So I'm really excited about this topic that we're going to talk to today, which is APCA. And
Mhm.
I brought this topic up when I spoke last week at the Creative Pro Design and Accessibility Summit, and
Mhm.
minds were blown. Designers' minds were blown. So I'm really excited for designers to hear about this, especially from the source. So
Well, good.
the first thing I wanted to ask that I was interested in is, how did you become interested in or even involved with contrast guidelines to begin with?
Well, as you mentioned in your introduction, I developed early onset cataracts, probably from sitting in front of three, bright
Mm,
wide gamut monitors 12 hours a day. But um, so I lost my eyesight, and it's partially restored. I'm legally blind in my right eye and have very low vision in my left eye.
hmm
Um, as a result of that, I'm going, I'm not going to let 35 years of experience in color and digital imaging go to waste. So I started writing a book, and I'm still working on this, a book on modern color theory.
Oh, wow.
Because there really is not a good book on modern color theory that really is well science-based, but also from a point of view of an artist.
hmm
So, and my background includes both engineering and art. So
Interesting.
it's a unique combination. Not unique in the film industry. That's actually pretty common here,
hmm
as you might guess, but otherwise fairly unique. While I'm doing research for my book, I come across this thing called WCAG 2 and this WCAG 2 contrast. And I see a number of designers are complaining about WCAG 2 contrast, and I look into it a little bit more. And I took a look at the math, and I go like, they're using the wrong math. Um, so I brought that to their attention after looking into it for a couple of weeks just to make sure that I wasn't mistaken, and I started the infamous thread 695 on GitHub at the WCAG repository. And for my troubles, they made me an invited expert, and I spent the next 4.5 years or so working on developing the contrast algorithm and guidelines. It was very obvious that it wasn't going to fit with the existing WCAG 2 without a major overhaul, and there's problems with backwards compatibility that
hmm
um, kind of interfered with that. So it was pushed into WCAG 3. That's many years away. So what I've done more recently is I founded Inclusive Reading Technologies as a consortium specifically for visual accessibility and for developing these guidelines to help fast track them and get them out for people to be able to use them more rapidly and to be more
hmm
flexible with emerging technologies. Display and monitor technology, we're right at the precipice of everything changing from the way it's been for the last 30 years.
hmm
Big paradigm shift. We have, high dynamic range monitors coming out now and much wider color spaces than the sRGB, which was the standard until like just last year when CSS 4 and 5 came out. So there's a lot of changes afoot, and we need to be flexible in addressing that. And that's a big part of the Inclusive Reading Technologies mandate.
Now, I know on your website you mentioned something about WCAG 2 and their calculations for contrast being out of date because of what the monitors that we're using today. Is that right?
I don't want to rag on WCAG 2 too much, because when it came about in 2005, in the film industry, we were having similar problems of misunderstandings
Mm,
going on in terms of how digital imaging should be done. As I mentioned, I mean, I started in the film industry back when we were shooting on actual film. And that transition period was about 15, 20 years from the 90s into
hmm
the late, the 2000 teens. And now pretty much everything is digital, but around the year 2000 to 2005, everything was in transition and everyone was going like, what do we do? Ones and zeros. How do we figure that out? And so there was a lot of work going along with that. And that was about
hmm
the same time that WCAG 2 came out. There were some choices made that ultimately uh, weren't flexible enough to move with technology. Let's just, I guess, put it that
Sure.
way.
Sure.
Um, the reality is that some aspects of the guideline are referencing some obsolete 1988 standards for monochrome CRTs.
hmm
And some parts of the guideline are looking at luminance and doing a luminance calculation it's not really perceptually uniform. And when I say perceptually uniform, what I mean is you've got, your two colors. If they're both fairly bright, it'll give you one number. And if you have two colors that look the same against each other, relatively speaking, it gives you a very different number. And as it gets darker, that number keeps going up. And so it really grossly over calculates or overestimates contrast for very dark colors as much as 200 to 250%. And that means that it can't be used for dark mode. And the last 2 years, dark mode has become very popular because you save energy on your phone. You save battery life by using dark mode on your phone. And that's one of the reasons it's become popular. It's also, for a lot of people, myself included, it's much less fatiguing to be working in dark mode than to be working in light mode all the time. Although one of the things that, if we have time, we might talk about, something that I'm going to be releasing in the next month or two, is something called the Paper Reading Experience, which is a set of guidelines for a web page in light mode that emulates the way we read on paper, so that you don't have that eye blazing fatigue that myself I get migraines just looking at light mode, because so many sites are set. So they've set the background to FFF white, and that's just too bright. When you think about a page of paper, it's like 85% reflectivity. And that's a diffuse reflectivity of your overall environment. You look at a monitor, it's like you're staring straight into a light bulb with text on it. It's like, and if you ever tried to read the text on the end of a light bulb when it's on, not so easy. And a lot of websites have been doing that lately. And then there's misunderstandings out there about, we should use light gray text because the places I found that actually seem to be the source of this are sites of complete misinformation. And it's what their motivation is in putting the misinformation out. That's probably a whole nother discussion, but there's a lot of misinformation out there. So one of the goals with APCA and the APC readability criterion, which is the guideline under inclusive reading technologies, it's not part of WCAG, it's separate, is to really reach out from an education point of view and go like, here's actually what the science says. We've been led astray on a lot of issues, and we need to fix that, because right now, I don't know about you, I can't read the internet most of the time. I have to go into reader mode, or I have to put on a custom user sheet for a lot of websites, including websites I use a lot, like Medium, just because they're doing things that are really interfere with the ability to read, I guess.
Well, I showed, when I was talking about, like I talked about this at the summit, the Creative Pro Summit, one of the, actually two of the examples I showed, that they were examples that fail WCAG based on their current calculations. So it was black on a medium orange, a little darker than what's behind me, and white on that same orange. And so I asked people, like, what color combination, is it the black or the white on the orange that you find easier to read? And most people were saying, the white, but the white fails. And then the other combination was a medium blue with black text on it and white text. And I mean, I've even had that same color combination used in a client say, how can that black text on the medium blue pass the WCAG calculations, right? And I've also seen research where it says, for usability, or readability purposes, most people find the white on those two colors, those particular colors, easier to read. So I noticed that with APCA, that actually, those combinations would pass. But like, you did a lot of research, you were testing 500 randomly chosen color combinations, from what I understand.
Thousands, actually thousands. We had independent studies. So I did a couple of studies using groups of 500 random colors. A PhD at Cambridge in the UK did an independent study as part of the peer review process, and he used, I think, 5,000 colors.
Oh wow!
And found pretty much the same thing that I did. That WCAG 2 was allowing some 47% of the colors that it was passing really should have been rejected as not readable. And paradoxically, at the same time, it was rejecting about 23% of the colors it was rejecting were perfectly readable, and in fact better for people with color vision deficiencies. And this is one of the paradoxes that is most concerning to me. And some of the early adopters that I'm working with right now are people that have color vision deficiency, what's commonly known as colorblind. And yeah, they all have a problem with WCAG 2. It doesn't help them. And if you think about, let's talk about oranges. I mean, blues in classical design, you would never have blue as your lightest of two colors. Not saturated blues. Saturated blues are always your darkest of two colors. That's known for hundreds of years. And partly because there's literally no luminance in blue. It doesn't get decoded into luminance, and luminance, with just the achromatic lightness darkness, is what we need. I'll have some examples of that in a moment. But reds and colors that have a lot of red in them, like oranges and purples, somebody with protanopia who doesn't see the deep reds, they will see the red on an sRGB display about 50% darker. So the oranges, the purples, the reds that they see get much darker, in some cases almost black. So if you're pairing those colors with black, it gets much worse for them. So that's an incorrect way to work that problem. Those colors usually, very saturated colors like that, usually need to be paired with white with a large enough font, because you're also going to have some other contrast issues in there. You don't want to have a very thin font when you have highly saturated colors. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's also part of the first demonstration that I'm going to show you guys. So the short answer is, yeah, WCAG 2 is wrong as far as the contrast math. It's not correct. And I've been on record with that, since 2019, when I started this whole project. And it's been a long way to get to where we are now. And I thought I'd be done in like 3 months, 6 months. I was so naive. There's actually, this is an under-researched area. There's a lot of new science that we're working on, and that needs to be worked on in terms of studies. As far as where we got things, it wasn't just research. I mean, we've done empirical studies, and we've developed experiments for measuring the kind of contrast that we need to measure for text, which is different than a lot of methods that have been used in the past, like Michelson or Weber contrast, which are all about the threshold, that very thin line between visible and invisible. But that's not where we want text. We want text above that, an area we call suprathreshold. And our vision changes. The way we calculate this or model this is significantly different. And it's not a small thing. And in fact, it accounts for most of how the WCAG 2 math skews in the wrong direction. And anybody that's a photographer might be familiar with the 18% gray card, often referred to as middle gray. It is middle gray in some ways, in terms of like just between black and white. If you have a spinning disc with black and white on it, it will mix into this middle gray, about 18%. But that is not middle contrast. Middle contrast is somewhere else. And this is one of the key discoveries that led to the current APCA. Is middle contrast is higher than that. And you need to have that center point moved higher to have a smooth range from black all the way to white. And that was one of the key goals, is to be perceptually uniform. That allows us to use it in an automated capacity. Right now with WCAG 2, you don't know what you're going to get. If you just feed into it 4.5 to 1, you don't know if you're going to get something that's readable or not, because if the colors are very dark, it's not going to be readable. So we need something that's even and perceptually uniform across the entire visual range. And that was one of the key goals and key achievements. So let's talk about APCA. We're going to discuss the importance of perceptually uniform contrast. Some of the things that we want to talk about, and something I want to mention right away, is pix is not pixels. The CSS px, that unit, is actually related to the canvas, not necessarily to the pixels on a screen. I just want to
Really?
mention that, and I'll call them pix. Yes, it's actually a different measure that is based on the visual angle, which is why I use it as a reference, and it is what everything gets reduced down to. So, as an example, you have the screen pitch on a phone, for example, is a much higher density number of pixels, and that's designed to be relative to how far away you normally are using the device.
Mm.
Um, so how do you figure out how big that needs to be? And you use the visual angle of how something gets projected onto the back of your eye, onto your retina. The CSS reference pix is that unit, and it is based on it's 1.278 arc minutes of visual angle, and there's 60 arc minutes in 1 degree, so it's 1.278 of a 60th of a degree.
Hmm.
So luminance is king, and that is what we need for reading. And lightness is nonlinear, and darkness and contrast is very spatially oriented. And those are the key things that I hope that we can get through today. Luminance is king. Luminance is the achromatic without color lightness to darkness. And that actually makes up most of what we see. There's actually very little color. Our vision system throws away most of the color information, and almost all of our fine details are in luminance. But rather than describe that, let me demonstrate. I use a parrot because they're very colorful and they have a lot of fine detail in them. So this is the original image here. And on the next couple of slides, I'm going to show how the luminance is handled in our vision system separately from the color aspects of an image. Okay, so on the left is the original image. On the right is the luminance part only. It's basically like a black and white TV with no color information in it. And as you can see, it's a very highly detailed image of that same parrot, just without color. So let's take a look at the color part. And so on the right of your screen now is just the color information. And it's probably kind of hard to see because it's there's no luminance associated with it. It's just the pure color. So putting just a flat amount of luminance at different levels here, you can see what that color is, the amount of color information that's associated with that image. Not a lot. It's very sparse. Part of the reason is that in our eye, each eye has 5 million photoreceptive cells called cones. So you can think of each eye as a 5 megapixel camera, but we only have 1.2 million optic fibers down our optic nerve from our eye to our brain. How do you get 5 million down 1.2 million? Nature is the first data compression and throws away most of the color information and reduces it down to mainly luminance with a little bit of color added on as flavoring. And it's processed separately as well. So here's the original image. And the next image, we're going to blur only the luminance, but not the color. If you look really closely, you can see that some of the color edges are still there in the color information, but the luminance only is blurred. Now on the next image, we're not going to blur the luminance, but we're going to blur the color the same amount that the luminance is blurred right now. Okay? So the color here, the color channels are blurred just as much as the luminance was on the previous slide. But now it looks like a normal picture.
Right.
Because
it does.
all of the detail is in the luminance channel and not in color. So on the left is the original. On the right is the blurred color only with unblurred luminance. So here on the left is blurred luminance. On the right is blurred color. So when we're talking about luminance, we're really talking about that is where we get all of our detail information, all of our edge detection, all of our fine information. It's all in a black and white channel called luminance. And that's the first thing to be processed in the visual cortex in our brain. Color is processed later, like 70 milliseconds later, which is like almost 2 film frames delayed. And in fact, just as a fun fact, from the point that light hits your retina and your eye to the point that it is presented to your conscious mind as an image is about 1/5 of a second. It's about 200 milliseconds. So literally what you're seeing right now happened 1/5 of a second ago.
Wow.
Yeah. So moving on.
Oh, these hurt my eyes.
Yeah, these are yeah, and intentionally so. So this is an example of the first three ovals are maximum color contrast, but no luminance contrast, and the bottom one is luminance contrast with no hue contrast. There's some saturation contrast, but there's no hue contrast. It's mainly just luminance contrast.
Okay, so let's just describe these real quick. We've got a light blue text with a pink, hot pink outline. And then we've got that on an orange background with a hot pink outline. And then we've got more hot pink text with a lighter hot pink outline on a blue background with an orange outline. This is really hurting my eyes.
Yeah.
And then
This
we've
is like,
got, yeah, then we've got orange with a almost green, like turquoise outline on a hot pink with a turquoise outline. And then we've got the better choice, which is the
yeah,
darker blue with the kind of like light purpley gray on a lavender color background, I guess you'd say, with the lighter
right.
outline. So, okay. Yeah, those
And don't
hurt,
try
the
this.
three hurt my eyes.
That's yeah. So like, you
Don't
know,
stare at the sun.
people talk about the Gaudi era of art, and I don't know, here in Los Angeles, there's a lot of Gaudi pieces at the Getty Museum, and they're a lot like this. They're just like really hard to look at because they're just so like, turn that down, please, kind of a thing. And we're not really meant to look at colors that are this saturated and this bright next to each other without the addition of luminance contrast. It's the luminance contrast that gives us all of the shape and detail of our world. Color, the pure color aspect, is something that's very useful for discrimination and distinguishing between a ripe orange and a not ripe orange, which is one of the theories as to why we have that color as a survival trait. But not so great just having them like this as something to look at. I mean, it's really hard to read that what it actually says is bad design choice. So, and I bring this up because originally in WCAG 2, they called it color contrast, but they're actually not doing color contrast there either. They're doing luminance contrast, just a different kind of luminance contrast, which I'll get to in a second. And that's what we need for reading, because all the fine details are in luminance and text is small and fine. And so that's what we need to actually see text properly. And that is the only thing that gets sent to the visual word form area of the brain for lexical processing on the left side of our brain. It's just text that is a function of luminance. By the time it gets to our language center on the left side of our brain, the color information is thrown out. Like, you might have played that game that's called a Stroop test, where somebody shows you some words like the word red, the word green, but on the word green, the letters are actually in the color yellow or red or something. And they go like, what color are all the letters? You're going to say green, because your language center has processed that as green, even though the actual color of the letters is red. Once it gets to your visual word form area, color information is actually not there. So it gets to your conscious mind through another route. And so you're going to first say the language that you read first, unless the letters are so big that you're doing them letter at a time, in which case it's more likely that that information gets sent over to object recognition on the right side of the brain, which is a whole nother story. The other aspect of vision that is not intuitive, and I'm trying to bring up the things that are least intuitive, that are so many misunderstandings are about here. One of them is that when we go from dark to light, it's not a straight line. Now, in the real world, light isn't a straight line, and light is additive. So if you have 100 photons of light and you have a cup of photons and you triple it, you have 300 photons of light. And it's very simple math. And that's how we do like physical rendering and ray tracing. But when it comes to how we actually see that light, we don't see it as a tripling. So in this example here, the ampersand is a light gray, and that is 3 times brighter than the darker gray next to it. And then that white outline is 3 times brighter than that middle gray, or 9 times brighter than the darker gray. And the other thing I want to point out too is look at the ampersand and how well that stands out, and then look at the thin text above it that says example.
Right. The ampersand is really thick, and
Yeah, and it's very easy to see, even though this contrast here is actually pretty low, because it's 3 times. So technically you could say it's 300%, but that's not really how we measure. We don't measure contrast that way in any real way. But and this is one of the problems with say with WCAG 2 is that when we get darker here, that's a big difference. That 300% difference 3 times, and it rates it as being a big difference, but it really shouldn't be. This is really only a difference of about I want to say it's LC. I think it's like LC 30 or something like that. So it's kind
And
of at the
explain,
low end of the range.
like, can you explain what LC means really quick? So just, I mean, I've seen it on your
Oh yes,
website, but just what it stands
yes,
for.
and I am going to get to that. So LC
Okay.
is the APCA output, which means lightness contrast, and I'm going to get to that here in just half of a second. So push this button. There we go. So this is a representation of how we see from dark to light. Above is light in the real world. So that's a linear gradient where you go a certain distance from left to right. No matter where you are in that distance, the light is increasing by that same linear amount. Below that, though, is linear to our perception. So we perceive that dark to light differently, and it has a different curve. And Stevens found in the 1960s that it's a power curve. So that's the blue curve in this graph is perceptual lightness, and the pink or magenta-ish curve, that's a straight line. I shouldn't say not a curve, but a straight line. That's actual physical light in the real world. It's a straight line from 0 to max, but we don't see it as that straight linear line. And it gets even more interesting is that there's not just one curve. The curve depends on the environment that we're in. It depends on the kind of monitor that we're looking at. It depends on where we're at in terms of lightness and darkness. So if we have 2 dark colors, but they're on a monitor that the rest of the monitor is very bright, or we're in a bright room, we're not going to see that with the same curve that we would see if we're in a dark room. And here's the example. I don't know if anybody goes to Saturday matinees anymore. I did when I was a kid. That's how old I am. So, you're in this dark theater and you're dark adapted to the very dark theater because movies are actually shown at a very low light level. And you walk out to the noon sun, and it's like, for me, it was painful. And it takes like 2 or 3 minutes to adjust, or what we call adapt to that brighter environment. It's called light adaptation. So our light adaptation level, where we're at in terms of darkness and lightness in our environment, speaks directly to how these curves become shaped. And that or maybe a better way to say this is, it speaks directly to how we perceive between lightness and darkness. It's very keyed or tied into our environmental adaptation state. But the other aspect, and here's the, and
yeah, this is interesting.
Sort of
I remember this from your site. Yeah.
So this is the biggest part, and this has been known for a long time, but it hasn't gotten into readability standards until APCA. So the understanding of spatial frequency and contrast sensitivity as it relates to that has been known since the 60s, at least, and really before then. Stevens, again, was one who was very active in this area, but it hasn't really been applied to text until now. And so to make the abstract science more understandable, what I've done is I've taken text at different sizes and associated them with where they would land more or less on the blue curve, and that is our contrast sensitivity curve, the human contrast sensitivity curve. So as things get smaller, all of the text on the right side there, all of it is at the same exact color. It's all
Really?
C7, C7. It's all the same color. All of those pieces of text are identical, but they obviously they don't look identical.
No,
and they don't look identical because they're all at a different. They all have a different spatial characteristic. Technically, we'd say the spatial frequency is increasing when they get smaller and thinner. But for us, working in the design world, we can just say that when things get smaller and thinner, we need to have a bigger color difference for the same amount of visual contrast or perceived contrast. And you can see that the difference is substantial. From
Right.
that large headline down to the little bit at the bottom, we're talking a change in contrast sensitivity by 2 orders of magnitude. It's like 220 times different
So, and so we're just
than
going from large and bold to a little bit smaller, not so bold, and so forth, down to this tiny, thin type.
right.
Yeah.
Which is so the at the bottom there, it's you probably can't read it, but it's 12 pix at 300 weight. It's really too small, even if you had maximum contrast, which I don't know if I have that slide in here today, but I didn't want to dwell too much on that and get to another example here really quick. But the point here is, as things get smaller and thinner than 4 to 8 pix,
hmm
our sensitivity to that, a contrast sensitivity to that element plummets rapidly. And so this is the main area that APCA is working with, is this range where it goes from a fairly low spatial frequency to a very high one, that we need to like come up with some guidelines, because we're usually pushing that edge. Body text is usually pushing that edge. As an example, body text, we typically want somewhere around 16 to 18 pix. And that's right on the edge of what our perception capabilities are, even if you don't have an impairment. And then when you have an impairment, and you have impairments that can affect your acuity, or that can affect your contrast sensitivity, or your color perception, that all plays into this as well.
hmm
So to make this another, maybe an easier to grasp example, this all the samples on here are at 3 to 1 in WCAG 2. So the top row, the outline is 1 pix. It's a 1 pix thick outline, and the font that was chosen is also, the strokes on that is about 1 pix. It's Montserrat, and which is a fairly geometric font. So then below that is 2 pix, 3 pix, and 4 pix. Notice that they're all at 3 to 1, but the ones that, as we go down and they get thicker and bolder, become much more visible. So the contrast goes up because of that change in spatial. They all pass, except for the top one at 3 to 1. The next slide is exactly the same text and exactly the same outlines, but at 7 to 1. Did you see the difference? It looks almost the same, doesn't it? This is 7 to 1. This is the
Yeah, I
AAA
mean,
level.
the 3
Let's
pix
go
and the
back
4
one.
pix, they look more pronounced, but the
A little
top
bit, they look a
one,
little bit more pronounced,
the
but
top one, I don't see a difference.
right, exactly. So, and let's look at them now side by side. So 3 to 1 on the left, 7 to 1 on the right. And you'll see that really the biggest differences here is not so much the color contrast difference, but the weight contrast difference, the spatial difference. And if we take a look here, so like more or less, it's not exact here, but more or less like the 2 pix on the 3 to 1 looks kind of like the 1 pix on the 7 to 1.
Sure.
The 4 pix on the 3 to 1 is kind of like the 2 pix on the 7 to 1. That depends, of course, how far away you are from your monitor when you're looking at it. You get closer, that's good. That's actually going to shift. That's going to change. So, and this is one of the things that comes up, like, well, so how do we make a decision of how thick is for a certain level of contrast? And
Right.
remember, so before I mentioned, and in research, we use the visual angle, because that doesn't matter how far away it is. The visual angle is going to be the same. We just make things smaller as they get closer to have that same angle. And the CSS reference pix is, in theory, based on angle. A lot of manufacturers do just assign it to device pixel, but like for a retina display, that's not the case. For a retina display, you have 4 or 9 device pixels for 1 CSS pix. And Apple doesn't even use pix in their developer guide. They use points, which is a whole nother story. The point here, though, is that we know that the pix is designed to be a certain angle at a typical viewing distance. So for if you had a 96 PPI monitor, that would be 28 inches away, as an example. And that's like the standard point where people would normally use it. And that's what we base how much contrast we need for one of these things on. And then they might be move closer, move farther away as they need to adjust for themselves personally. But that's how we come up with that.
Mhm.
So here, just carrying through with the same idea, on the left side of this image, the text is, each line of text is 100 weight higher than the right side of the image. And the only other difference is the left side of the image is LC15 less than the right side of the image. So if you look at this from about the right distance, about the normal operating distance, you shouldn't really see a difference between the left and the right. It becomes 100 weight lower, but the contrast is pushed up by LC15. And that's about the approximate balance. And I say approximate, if you get closer to it, it's going to weight itself more towards the weight and the thickness. If you get farther away, you'll be weighted a little bit more toward the actual color difference.
Okay, so everything's 24 picks. And then we've got on the
Yes.
left, we've got it starts at 300 and goes all the way to 900 in weight. And then on the right, it goes from 2 to 8. Okay, so now I see more of the difference there. But the visual, like, so LC45, that text at 900 weight does look, it looks very similar to the 24 picks in the 800 weight. That's LC60. Yeah. And then same for LC60 and 75 at the higher, the 900 and the 800 respectively there. Yeah.
And the 900 and 800 are probably the worst example, that they probably match the worst. If you look more in the middle, like say around the 400, 500, 600 range, you'll be maybe squinting your eyes a bit. I know I certainly do, to go like, is it different? Am I looking at the right thing? It's like, because in that middle range, it's in that middle range, and that same middle range there is the range where our sensitivity is plummeting because of the spatial frequency aspect that becoming too thin. And the important spatial aspect here is about the thinness or thickness of the line or the stroke, more than anything else. That's actually what sets contrast, is the thickness or the thinness of a line before the color. Now, the color is like a secondary thing. So that is the most important aspect that I wanted to get through today. And so let's take a look at APCA, the Accessible Perceptual Contrast Algorithm. So, and here's why we came up with this, and to answer your earlier question regarding a WCAG2 contrast, it's not uniform to perception. So that little square of black there with the very difficult to read text, all of it passes WCAG2.
The dark gray text on the black, and then we have the lighter gray text on the black. Okay, so the dark gray passes at 3 to 1, and then the lighter gray at 4.5 to 1 against the black. Yes. Okay.
Right, and that is for so that the big text, the one that's most easy to read, is AAA.
Yes.
And the other stuff is AA. And the AA, I can't read it at all. I can barely even tell that there's text there. Yeah, you probably have better eyes than I do. I keeping in mind that I'm blind, so I do still have difficulties reading it. I'm one of the test subjects of the people that doing the studies. And I have actually a different impairment in each eye, so I kind of have an opportunity to do a lot of experimentation just because I can close one eye or the other and get a different viewpoint.
Right.
But yeah, for something like this, for somebody who has low vision like me, and have some contrast problems, or somebody who has glaucoma or something like that, where they have contrast issues, they're not going to be able to read this. It's impossible to read, but it passes WCAG2. And this is really the core of the problem. So
you're saying are you saying at AAA, they would have issues reading that as well? The AAA one?
Yeah. For dark mode like this, where the background is black, yes, absolutely. That's not enough contrast.
Because a lot of designers might say, well, that's AAA, so that should be even better. But you're saying people would still have a problem with that, even though it's AAA. So AAA is not always, the
WCAG2 contrast only works when the background is very light or white and the text is much darker. And that's really the only time it works. It doesn't work in any of the reverse situations, and it doesn't work in dark mode. And when it was originally conceived, like I said, we had similar problems here in Hollywood in terms of understanding about how some of these things worked in digital monitors. And when it was conceived in 2005, they knew that there were some problems, but they you know, they were wrestling with them, and there's a lot of other things in WCAG 2. And I want to, this is something I want to say that it's really important, and I want to be clear about. There's a lot in WCAG 2 that's very good and very important for accessibility. Just not the contrast. And then the problem with that is the contrast is bad enough that it pulls the rest of the document down, but really you need to use the entire document and then use something else for contrast. And you could just use it on top of WCAG 2. You
Right.
put APCA on top, because there's a couple of weird edge cases where it's incorrectly, WCAG 2 is incorrectly rejecting colors that APC does not incorrectly reject. It, correctly passes them. Those edge cases are a little odd, but other than that, we're using APCA, you will, and the readability criteria, if you're using it correctly with the correct font sizes, you will exceed WCAG 2, even AAA, and you will actually create a much more accessible result, and a result that everybody has a better time reading. And that's one of the important things to answer that question.
Yeah, because one of the things that I mentioned, Andy, at the summit, at the Creative Pro Design and Accessibility Summit, was these are not so it's I didn't want them to get confused or overwhelmed by hearing like, oh, now there's these other, like, because I said, look, this is not legal yet. WCAG 3 isn't here yet, but what you can do now, because a lot of people have that legal requirement, right? If they're running a checker on a website and it's trying to measure contrast and it fails, somebody, that could be a potential legal issue. So my suggestion was, yeah, so what you can do is measure in WCAG, but also measure at APCA, so that you have met that legal requirement there with the colors, right? But then you've got, or that conformance rather, and then you've got this extra more usable color pair now because you've also checked it with APCA. So if it passes both places, that should be good.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're passing both places, it should be good. There's a lot of things that we're doing, like for dark mode, there's no maximum contrast for light mode. There should be a maximum luminance, but that's something we're dealing with the paper reading experience. For dark mode, there is a maximum contrast, and right now we're evaluating for small text minus 90. And incidentally, with APCA, when you're in dark mode, so the text is lighter than the background, your LC value will always be negative, and that's why you know that it was calculated correctly for dark mode as opposed to light mode, because the numbers for two colors, the numbers are different in APCA. And that is why the fact that the numbers are different, because APCA recognizes that dark mode and light mode have different needs. That is the one reason why APCA is not backwards compatible with WCAG 2, because it doesn't do that. So, and that's actually, just before I forget, we do have something called Bridge PCA, which is fully backwards compatible with WCAG 2 with enhanced guidelines, and completely backwards compatible, and also forwards compatible with APCA bronze mode. What you lose when you do both is you lose some design flexibility, because APCA and the APCA readability criterion is based around human perception, and including people with different kinds of impairments. It allows, APCA actually will come up with fewer colors in terms of numbers, but the colors it comes up with are all usable. Whereas, as I mentioned, WCAG 2 might come up with a bunch of colors, but they're not all usable. That brings us to WCAG 2 is currently the current recommended standard of the World Wide Web Consortium. It is not law in a lot of places yet. There's a few places that have adopted it. They brought it into law. So WCAG 2 technically by itself is just a voluntary guideline.
Right.
But there are some countries like, say, France and Germany, who they actually took the guidelines and pulled them out and renumbered them and put them in their own law. Or the EU did this with EN 301. And that actually doesn't fully take effect for everybody until, I think, 2030. So there's still wiggle room on some of these things. In the United States, there's the 501 rule, which really only applies to government websites or government funded websites, but it has an important exception in it.
Oh, 508, section 508.
The section 508, which is part of the U.S. Access Board. So, And they need to have a exception like this in Europe as well, and they don't yet. The exception in 508 is equivalent facilitation. If you have a way to equivalently come up with, say, contrast as an example, and you're actually improving accessibility overall, that counts. So you don't have to use WCAG 2 with 508 if you're using something else that is also qualified as being something that is improving accessibility. APC 8 absolutely does that. So, and I've even spoken to a number of people who agree with this, and it actually is in the 508 standard. Equivalent facilitation. The other one is commercial availability for like apps. So if a government entity wants to buy an app and it doesn't fit accessibility, and a lot of things don't, because WCAG 2, there's aspects of it that are very difficult to meet, especially for apps. If it's not commercially available, then that's excluded, or it's accepted from that particular law. So there is in Ontario, and as an example in Canada, they're fairly strict about it. And I think Germany, France, and I want to say Finland, I think, is one other one where it's getting enacted into law. But most places, it's still a voluntary guideline. And like I said, there's a lot of WCAG 2 that's important to incorporate. Things like, semantic HTML and ARIA and things like that. It's just that the contrast has some issues with it. Bridge PCA, like I said, is fully backwards compatible, but you lose some design flexibility that needs to be in there. And the reason is APCA has a much higher contrast requirement for things like body text, where it's really needed in order to be good readability. Well, if we're going to make that a higher contrast, we need to relax it in some other areas where it doesn't need to be as high, like big, bold headlines, like we showed on that contrast sensitivity graph, didn't need to be nearly as high contrast as the smaller text did. What we're doing right now is Inclusive Reading Technologies Incorporated is a California nonprofit consortium of other industry stakeholders. And this is not the official announcement yet, so I'm not saying who's involved, but a number of major stakeholders are. And we're working specifically to bring this not just to the web, but as a visual accessibility guideline for everything digital, all apps, anything else that you need to be able to read or discern. This is going to apply to all of those different use cases and scenarios. And that's a big part of this. And we have the draft guidelines are up right now at readtech.org/ARC. And you just go there, and there's a link that will take you to the actual draft guidelines. And it's a public working draft, and there should be links there that indicate where to go to talk about it. And we are really encouraging feedback on this, any problems that people might have, or any comments of any kind. We have on GitHub, we have a repository with a discussion area where people, bring up issues or comments so that we can really make this work well for everybody. To help people get started, we have the bronze level conformance, which is designed to be just as simple as WCAG 2, just a few levels and a few minimum font sizes to think about to get people used to working with perceptually uniform contrast.
Would you say, sorry, would you say that bronze level is kind of, I mean, I know it has different specs in it, but would you say bronze level is kind of like the WCAG, I don't know, AA, and then your silver level is like AAA, or is there like not even a comparison? But I mean, like in terms of like there's different levels.
Yes, but it's bronze. I'll put it to you this way. The bronze simple level is conceived so that people who have well-designed sites now will pass without having to really do a whole lot. Because one of the things that we were concerned about early on was, if we really do things most correct in terms of like classical design guidance of how we normally used to do things, we never would use gray ink in a printer. We'd always be doing setting up for an offset press run. You're always going to be using black ink. It's pretty rare to use anything else. You might use one other color, like some spot color, like red or something.
Yeah. So then I was wondering, okay, so you have the bronze and the silver level. Okay. And
And a gold
then,
level.
and there's a gold level too. Okay.
Yeah,
And
so
then,
there's 3 levels.
okay. And so, all right, well, that's akin to WCAG. All right. But there are some differences, which you've gone over quite a few of them, right? But the way it calculates, like, I know that the difference, like you were talking about, there's a positive or negative number based on if the positive number is if the foreground color is lighter than the background color, and then
The-
is that correct?
Yeah,
And
so
then vice versa.
the positive number is if you're in light mode, where you have
Mhm.
a light background with dark text.
Oh,
And
okay.
the negative number is if you're in dark mode, which
Mhm.
I know, and this is confusing because there's negative and positive contrast, which is actually the opposite of negative and positive screen contrast.
Mhm.
And I went with screen contrast because in talking to people, that seemed to be what they understood more intuitively, and that's
Mhm.
why dark mode is negative and light mode is positive.
Mhm.
And that's there mainly to give the designer an indication of that the number that they're looking at relates to this in a particular polarity, because that does change how we perceive the amount of contrast that's there.
Mhm.
And when we're in a particular pair of colors, when you if you're in light mode, if you just flop those two colors around, you'll have a higher perception of contrast than you did in the other direction.
Mhm.
And so that's why there's a difference there, and you'll get a different LC number with that too. So
Mhm.
with the bridge PCA mode, and I'm going to be incorporating this into the main APCA tool soon as a switch that will go into non-polar mode, which is like basically like the backwards mode to emulate WCAG 2,
Mhm.
so that if you need to, you could be working in an APCA related environment, but you're in a mode that is backwards compatible. I hesitated doing that, but I know that right now there's concerns, as you mentioned, about legalities in some areas, because
Mhm.
it's going to be at least another 4 years, I think, until WCAG 3 is the actual recommendation.
Mhm.
And there's a real need for this right now, because dark mode is more popular, because CSS, there's the CSS color contrast function that got pushed into CSS 6 now, because it doesn't work with WCAG 2 contrast math, because it's not perceptually uniform. It has to have a perceptually, anything that you want to do automated. If you want to automate something where you don't want to have a person looking at it to validate it, where it's going to be automated, you
Mhm.
need a model that fits perception so that
Mhm.
you know what you're going to get. And
Mhm.
so you need that perceptual uniformity. And that's what APCA does. 4 years is a little bit too long for everyone to wait for that. With everything that's going on right now, with all the new emerging technologies in terms of displays and high dynamic range and so forth, and P3 and everything like that.
Mhm.
And so that's one of the reasons why uh, inclusive reading technologies was developed, in order to help push this along a little bit faster. WCAG 3 is not just doing contrast. They're doing an enormous number of other things for accessibility. It's a huge undertaking. It's
Yeah.
absolutely massive. And my focus has only been on contrast. And so by setting up inclusive reading technologies, I can focus on what is my strength,
Mhm.
in terms of color and vision and these things.
Mhm.
And without slowing up, without I guess being bogged down with everything else that's going on with WCAG 3. And they have so much going on, because they're not just changing, they're not just coming up with new standards, they're coming up with a new paradigm of how standards are presented to people and how you
Mhm.
actually work with them. And that's a lot. And, last summer, they more or less went back to square one again and are reworking things. And I think they're at a much better place now. But, they currently, like I said, I think 4 years is maybe even optimistic.
Mhm.
Um, but people need a better contrast now, and they've been clamoring for it. And I was not expecting, actually, uh, the response. It's been really positive, and a lot of people are very eager
Mhm.
to be using it. And so that's where some of these concerns about, can we? And so part of this is, coming up with ways that yes, we can.
Mhm.
And I was hoping by the end of the year. I don't think we're going to make it on the end of this year, but first quarter of next year, we hope to have the new guidance out for on the site. Right now, there's an early draft is up at readtech.org. We're going to have a much newer draft that's going to include this is how this connects to WCAG 2.
Mhm.
And if you follow this one path, you will be backwards compatible. And we've been working on that the last couple of months, and a couple of users had brought up, like, maybe what if we do it this way? What if we turn off the polarity sensitivity, as an example, and because WCAG 2 doesn't do that, that will actually make it so that everything under LC75 will beat 4.5 to 1 and do so handily.
Mhm.
If you're in this non-polar mode. So we're going to add the non-polar mode. Two other things we're adding in the next couple months is a specific module for dealing with certain kinds of color vision deficiencies, and also a direct output of how thick your line should be for non-text.
Mhm.
And then the paper reading experience is just a set of guidelines that, and if you look at the readtech.org website, most of it is in this style that is set up where you have a bright white border that's thick, like at least 6 pixels thick, that anchors your eye at an adaptation point for brightness. But then the text is on a background that is at about 85% of that, which is about what paper is. So you end up with a background for the text at the lightness of diffuse paper, and the bright border locks your
Mhm.
eye in terms of your perception. Because if you just look at, let's say you just set your background to DDD, which is a little dark, but let's say you just did that. Well, your eye, if that was the only color for your background, your eye is just going to make that white, and you're going to adapt to that, and that's going to become your peak white. So that's not going to help you for fatigue. The problem with fatigue is you adapt to whatever the brightest thing is on your screen. And if that's too bright, it's like looking into a light bulb. You've adapted to this bright light, and you end up with visual fatigue after an hour or so, or however long it takes for some people. For me, it's like 20 minutes.
Mhm.
But if you can make this part that you're actually looking at so that your periphery is anchored with that bright white border, but the text is against 85%, you won't have that same eye blazing fatigue that you get looking at sites with a white background. That I get, at least. Not
Mhm.
everybody does. Some people prefer that, particularly
I
people with
prefer it.
younger eyes.
I
Yeah.
prefer, well, my eyes aren't so young anymore, but I
Well,
prefer light mode.
and I mean, if you have a astigmatism, I know people with astigmatisms, and I have an astigmatism, I still prefer dark mode, but a lot of people with
Mhm.
astigmatisms don't like dark mode. It takes
Mhm.
a little bit of getting used to. The funny thing is that back when I first got into computers, which was in the 1970s, everything was light mode. We didn't have color screens. Everything was like either green and black or yellow
Right.
and black, or,
I
if you
remember
were,
that.
yeah, exactly. And so you were always working in that kind of light mode way.
Mhm.
And then when color screens came along, and actually really was Mac, actually Xerox PARC, and then Mac came up with the whole, well, let's make it paper white. And those were little CRTs, and they weren't that bright, so they weren't really eye blazing. But
Mhm.
these new modern monitors, I mean, these new modern monitors can be so bright, you can use them outdoors, and they're so bright. It's literally the light, staring into a light bulb effect, that
Mhm.
or the snowblind effect is what I sometimes refer to it. It's
Mm.
not as bad as being snowblind, because that's actually an ultraviolet damage. You're sunburning your eyes, but it feels like that to me sometimes.
Mm.
So, and then I guess the last thing they mentioned is that on dark mode, one of the reasons that a lot of people don't like it is because there's too much contrast between the light letters and the dark background. And especially as you get older, the ocular medium in your eyes, your lens starts to get a little bit cloudy. You get a lot more scattering and halation. So everything looks like it has a glow around it.
Mm.
And that's often due to just too much contrast between the background and the light letters. And that's why experimenting right now with maximum contrast for dark mode. So there's that.
And people with Irlen syndrome can have issues when they have that really high contrast.
Yeah, so Irlen is kind of like there's some controversy about it, but certainly some people are helped by colored lenses. I don't think you need to spend $300 to have proper colored lenses. So that's kind of where the controversy goes. And really what we need right now is we need some more research and study in that area of it's also referred to sometimes as scotopic sensitivity syndrome, which again doesn't make a lot of sense to me because it's always happening in the photopic level of vision. Scotopic is their night vision, but it's actually happening when people are day reading and they see that swimming letter effect. But again, not enough research right now to really give some definitive answers. I haven't incorporated this in Bridge PCA yet, but it will be soon, and that is the non-polar mode for backwards compatibility, just so that people have something that's even more like what they're used to as we're moving forward, because I recognize that this is a big paradigm shift. And it's a lot to say rip the Band-Aid off all at once. So trying to do things in a staged way where there's easier to grasp concepts, and then as you develop, and a lot of this you'll recognize as classical design guidelines. Really, a lot of this stuff goes back to things that we've learned over the last several hundred years of print work, and as that can be applied. But you'll see that the guidelines at readtech.org/ARC, couched in these concepts like use cases of, here's an example. Your columns of body text need to have very high contrast because it's small, thin text, and you want people to be able to read that. We assume that you want people to be able to read your articles. But what about a copyright bug? The little R or stuff in the footer. Does that need to be at the same contrast? No, it doesn't. And in fact, you don't want that at the same contrast because you want to have a visual hierarchy that draws your eye through the important content, and you're not distracted by unimportant content. If everything was all at high contrast, then that makes it very difficult to look at the page. And in fact, this is one of the problems I have. I need more contrast, but like high contrast modes are very often way overdone, where everything is some blazingly high contrast. I can't tell what I need to be looking at. As a designer, we want to be using contrast to guide the viewer where we need them to be looking for the content, and having that visual hierarchy. That by definition means that not everything should be at the same high contrast. Some things need to be at lower contrast. Because WCAG 2 is not perceptually uniform, there's no way to use that contrast metric to come up with a good visual hierarchy, because it's too off. By the time you get into dark colors, it just doesn't make sense. With APCA, it's built around the concept of LC15, lightness contrast 15. Those are increments that we find are perceivable by most people, including people with impairments, as a difference between something that's like more contrasty or less contrasty. And that gives you a number of different levels of contrast that you can use depending on if it's important content or if it's something that's a throwaway, like a copyright bug or a disabled control. WCAG 2 doesn't have anything specified for disabled controls, but we do in APCA. We have guidance for that. We have guidance for the placeholder text, and if it's a label or not a label, and so on and so forth. All of these things are important, and they're important to have at least some general guidance on. And like I said, one of the big things here is having that visual hierarchy to help people really understand what's going on. And that's and this is one of the problems we have today is, like, there are websites out there that have so many blazing colors that it's like very distracting and really hard to look at, and people with ADHD might have problems with that, and they need something that's much more subdued and much more pastel, if you will. But they also need things that are ordered in such a way, with contrast in such a way that they know where they need to be looking. And this is something that, this is way in the future, I think, certainly not this coming year, is the idea of automation. Like we've talked about, we know we need a light mode and a dark mode, but you actually need 2 dark modes at least. We need a dark mode for daytime use and a dark mode for nighttime use. We need a couple of different light modes, depending on how much contrast somebody might need. We need Daltonization modes. Those are modes where colors are shifted to help people with a color blindness or a color vision deficiency. We need a lot of these different modes. That's a lot of work for a designer to come up with all these different modes. That's too much. You can't do it. So to make that happen, we need a perceptually uniform measure so that we can automate those things. So the designer can come up with 1 or 2 schemes, and all of the other schemes can be created automatically from those 2 base schemes in a way that will be predictable, because we have a model now that follows human perception. And using this human perception model, we can bring in automation and automate a lot of these tasks that right now requires a designer to I've seen some design systems where there's 130 colors. That's a lot to go through to come up with a different scheme where you have 130 different color variables that you need to work with. If that was all automated and you just need to maybe fix a couple, or hopefully not have to really fix any, that's an enormous workload that should be automatable, but can only be automatable with perceptual uniformity. And so that's what we're bringing to the table right now. And try to hint that we've got a lot more going on and a lot more fun stuff coming up that's going to be helpful, including another method that we're working on is called SACAM, which is the SJUV accessible color appearance model. So it's not just luminance, but it deals with hue and saturation as well. So it's a more complete model for coming up with palettes, not just for contrast. And that's in the lab right now, and we've been working on that off and on. It's not our highest priority because we have a lot of these other things that we need to get out sooner, but those are the things that are in the future that we're working on to help designers come up with better, more effective palettes that are accessible for everybody. And eventually we want, really the holy grail of accessibility is personalization, so that everybody can have what they're experiencing, their lived experience online, which is so much of our lives now, is tailored to what they need. There are so many aspects of visual perception in particular where what some person needs is a blocker for somebody else, or technically harmful for somebody else. And the only way to fix that problem is you don't want to have a lowest common denominator solution where everyone is brought down. You want to bring everyone up the most they can be. And to do that, you need real personalization. You need people to be able to select the mode that they want. And really, that's the direction that we're aiming all of this eventually.
That's great.
Yeah.
It's very interesting what's going on. A lot of things going on, and it's a lot of research. It's really interesting to hear that side of things too. Well, let's tell everyone where they can find the APCA contrast checker so they can start checking their colors.
So there are a number of third-party tools. There's a bunch in Figma that use, and most of the other third-party tools actually have both APCA and WCAG 2 on them. You can select between them. One of the ones that I like a lot is the tools from Stark. So Stark is an accessibility company, and they were one of the first to adopt. In addition to WCAG 2, there's a selection on their contrast checkers that allow you to use them, and it's a great tool. It's the Stark tools are really well developed, and there's also some other tools on Figma and at git.mindex.com. That's git.mindex.com. There's a list of resources, and actually, you know what? Probably the better one to give you would be there's a link tree. There's a link tree of the essential resources that includes tools and third-party tools and things like that, and some articles. And that's a link tree, linktr.ee/. github.com/Mindex. That's MYNDEX. And then for the readability guidelines, or the link that I showed on the last screen that I had up, is readtech.org. And that's where most things are going to be moving in the next year or two.
Okay.
At GitHub, I'm Mindex on GitHub, just MYNDEX, and you can find me there and see the repos that we have going on. The SAPC APCA repo is the main one for documentation. And
thanks so much, Andy. This has been really insightful, really interesting, and I
For me
think that
too.
this. Thanks, and I think that. I think, like you said, like more designers need to know about this, and I say that all the time too, but I think this is also going to, also give them back some color pairs that they have not been able to use because they were
Yes.
previously considered inaccessible. So I think that's gonna be really exciting for them too. So thank you so much
Absolutely.
for coming on. And then what's the best way for someone to get in touch with you if they have any questions they want to follow up?
So on GitHub, we have a discussion
Okay.
area at the SAPC APCA repo. We have a lot of repos associated with this, but that's the one for documentation. And we have a discussion area there. And I monitor it all day long, or not all day long, but I mean, every day I'm looking at it. So any questions that are answered there, they're asked there, I usually try to answer within a day. I also do try to field questions that are either sent to my Twitter account, which is Mindex Research on Twitter, and sometimes I'll take emails too if I can, if I have time. The emails, though, sometimes they get lost just because I get so many a day, and usually for things that have nothing to do with this. There's just so much spam these days. It's like, but I try to be responsive no matter where people try to get at me with any questions, because this is, again, I recognize that it's very new, and so part of the mission here is to help get this education and information out to everybody.
Great. All right. Well, thank you again so much. Really appreciate it.
All right. Right. Thank you.
If you're interested in learning more about accessibility, check out my free accessibility guides at creative-boost.com/freebies.